Thank you very much. Thank you, Hannah. Welcome, Tim. I'm Kamal Ahmed. I'm the economics editor of the BBC, but economists, who needs them? We're here today to talk about a fabulous book, Messy, which Hannah has mentioned. I'm a little bit worried that Tim will be a bit irritated at the way I prepared for this. I carefully read his very neat book. I have carefully annotated the pages I think I might ask him about, and I've made careful preparations for this whole event in a very neat, tidy, and slightly anal way that I have in my life. I get slightly cross if the chairs around my living table are a little bit skew-whiff. So Tim and I are going to join together tonight and see the joys of Messy. I just noted down a few bullet points that I'm going to ask Tim about, which might give you some sense of the breadth of this work, which builds on much of Tim's earlier work as well. These are the bullet points that I have written down: politics, business, automation, algorithms, improvisation, architecture, and life. So, Tim, small areas to debate, but you're going to give us a few words first to try and organize our minds, although that might actually be slightly the wrong way to look at it. Tim.
Thank you. I can see what you did there. Now, Kamal, one thing you didn't mention was jazz, and I feel we at least need to talk about that briefly. And I want to take you all back to a jazz concert that was about to happen in late January 1975. And the location of this concert was the Cologne Opera House, which is an absolutely enormous venue. This room, when it's completely full, seats 700 people. The Cologne Opera House seats 1,400, so it's a huge auditorium. And the moment I'm thinking of, the moment when this concert starts to be imperiled, is when a 17-year-old German girl walks onto the stage of the Cologne Opera House. It's completely empty. It's lit by the dim green glow of the emergency exit signs. Her name is Vera Branders. She is the youngest concert promoter in Germany. She just loves jazz. And she's been trying to get more jazz musicians to come to Cologne. And almost immediately, she has scored a mega hit. She has persuaded the Cologne Opera House to host a late-night concert of improvised jazz from the American pianist Keith Jarrett. So why is she walking out onto an empty stage in front of an empty auditorium? Because she's introducing Jarrett to the piano. In just a few hours, he will sit down at that piano without any rehearsal or sheet music. He's going to begin to play. So she introduces him to the piano. And Jarrett instantly looks suspicious. He plays a couple of notes. He paces around the piano. He plays a couple more notes. He turns to his producer. They start muttering in a huddle. You could imagine now Vera's pulse is starting to race. And then Keith Jarrett's producer comes over to Vera and says to this teenager, if you can't get a new piano, Keith won't play. There'd been a mistake. The team at the Cologne Opera House had brought up a rehearsal piano. So the felt was worn away in the upper registers. So they sounded tinny and harsh. It was out of tune. The black notes were sticking. The pedals didn't work. And it was too small. It just wouldn't generate enough volume to fill the opera house. Branders later said, yeah, it was a tiny piano. It was like half a piano. So, of course, what you would do is, call the opera house staff and get a proper grand piano in. The trouble is, it's Friday afternoon in Germany. Everyone's gone home. There is no one to call. So Jarrett leaves. He says the piano's unplayable. He leaves. Vera Branders jumps on the phone. She tries to get a replacement. It quickly becomes apparent there will be no replacement piano. She can get a piano tuner. She can smooth out a few of the rough edges, but basically, it's going to be a bad piano. And there are 1,400 people coming to hear Keith Jarrett play, and he's not playing. So Vera Branders does the one thing that she can think of to do. She goes outside, she looks for Jarrett. He's sitting in his car, it's raining. She goes up to him. She stands there in the rain and she begs him. She begs him to play. And he looks out through the rain-drenched windshield. He looks at this bedraggled German teenager, winds down the window. He says, "Never forget, only for you." And so a few hours later, in front of a packed auditorium, Keith Jarrett walks out on the stage, sits down at the unplayable piano, and he begins. And within a few moments, it becomes apparent something magical is happening. So Jarrett's avoiding the harsh, tinny upper registers. He's sticking to the middle tones, which gives the piece a rather soothing and ambient quality, but it doesn't become this new age kind of zone-out music because the piano's too quiet. So Jarrett has to give it some volume, and he sets up these rolling, rumbling riffs in the bass to try to generate some resonance and fill the hall. The other thing he does is to stand up and to pound down on the keys, moaning and just trying to hit the piano hard enough so that people at the back can hear. And that the tension between the energy with which Jarrett is playing the piano and the soothing notes that he's using gives this piece a very magical quality. I have 3 children. 2 of them were born while my wife was listening to Keith Jarrett's Cologne concert. She now has mixed feelings about it, I have to say. But the rest of us don't. It is magical, and it is the most successful piano concert in history. And you might ask, why was it even recorded if it was going to be so bad? It was recorded because Jarrett and his producer wanted a documentary record of what a musical catastrophe sounds like. So I want you to think about Jarrett's initial reaction. He didn't think, when he met the unplayable piano, excellent, crap piano, this will really be an opportunity to exercise my creative freedom. He thought, crap piano, crap concert, I don't want any part of it. Of course he thought that. Even an adventurous musician like Jarrett thought that. And I think the rest of us, when we're in a remotely comparable situation, when we're asked to do good work with tools that are breaking in our hands, or awkward people, or impossible deadlines, or distracting circumstances, we think this is no way to get the best out of me. Jarrett was wrong, and I think we're often wrong. Often these frustrating circumstances are a great way to get the best out of us. So let me briefly, before Kamal bothers me with his tidy questions, let me briefly explain why I think that might be. And I'll give you a few different perspectives from cognitive psychology, from social psychology, from complexity science, and lastly, and most importantly, from rock and roll. So, cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychologists have known for a while that if you put small obstacles in people's way, they will sometimes overcompensate. The idea is it's called desirable difficulties. So there are lots of little studies of this, lots and lots of them. My favorite one was conducted by a team led by a psychologist called Daniel Oppenheimer. What Oppenheimer's team did was to team up with high school teachers to run a randomized controlled trial. So imagine you're all in one set of classes for these teachers, you're all in another set of classes for these teachers. You all get your handouts formatted in something sensible like Arial or Times New Roman. You, on the other hand, get your handouts formatted in Hattenschweiler, very German font, Hattenschweiler, or maybe monotype cursiva, which is script-like, or maybe, just maybe, the zesty bounce of Comic Sans italicized. Now, you would think it can't possibly be advantageous to have your handouts formatted in Hattenschweiler. Wrong. When these students did their end-of-term exams, the ones who had been given the difficult handouts with the difficult fonts scored better than the ones who'd been given the straightforward handouts with the easy fonts. And the theory is, you guys, you get your handout in Arial or in Times New Roman. It seems so straightforward, you kind of feel like you've already read it. You just skim over, yeah, that's fine, I got it. You guys, on the other hand, you see Hattenschweiler and you think, what is this? And so you start to pay attention. It slows you down. You're interpreting more, you're thinking more. And so you get more out of the handout because it's more difficult. Well, you might say, well, that's just psychology. Who trusts anything out of psychology these days? So let me instead give you a perspective from complexity science. So imagine you're trying to solve an incredibly complex problem. There are lots of them out there: scheduling problems, packing problems. How do we fit the components on silicon chips? How do we schedule deliveries around a network? There are lots and lots of problems like this. And computer scientists have figured out how to solve them. Basically, you get a computer to run an algorithm, a kind of recipe for churning through different combinations and testing out different possibilities. Now, you can't test all the combinations because there are just too many. So one way of trying to solve this problem is to look for step-by-step improvements. So we'll try this way of organizing the computer chip, and then we'll swap a couple of components. Does that improve things? If so, keep that. Swap a couple more chips. Does that improve things? If so, keep that. Swap another couple of components. Does that improve things? Okay, just keep going, looking for step-by-step improvements. That's fine, that'll help, but you will hit a dead end. If this is the way you solve complex problems, you will hit a dead end. All of these algorithms that go for step-by-step improvements, they run down some blind alley, and then they can't get out of the blind alley because they're looking for improvements. And so computer scientists have figured out how to solve this problem. Lots and lots of different approaches. They all have one thing in common. They all involve adding random shocks. Just give the algorithm a nudge sideways and get it looking for step-by-step improvements somewhere else. Now, you might say, this all sounds rather abstract. Did anybody come here on the London Underground? Anyone? You poor, poor people. Actually, the ones who drove, I sympathize even more. Well, people who use the London Underground, you kind of optimize your route, don't you? You've got it all planned out. You especially if you're a commuter, you know where to stand on the platform. This is where the doors open, and if I get in this carriage, then when the train changes at Oxford Circus, then I can skip across and I can get to the Victoria line, and you promised yourself you would never become that person when you moved to London, but you did become that person, didn't you? You know where to stand. You would think, surely, nobody has their route to work optimized like a regular commuter. And then again, given what we just learned about the algorithms, maybe a random shock would improve things. But how could one inflict a random shock on the London Underground? Turns out there are some ladies and gentlemen who work for the trade unions who are very happy to do that. And there was a strike about 3 years ago, 48-hour strike, closed down 2/3 of London Underground stations. But other stations were still open, as were the buses, as were the overground trains. And 3 economists got hold of the data from the Oyster cards, and they said, we are going to identify commuters, people who take the same route every day from this data. We're going to identify commuters who change routes on the strike days, and then we're going to ask a simple question. Do they change back? And the answer is, of course, most of them change back, and of course, most of them didn't enjoy the strike. Tens of thousands stuck with the new route. Tens of thousands of commuters discovered they had been doing it wrong their entire lives. And only the random shock forced them to look for an alternative, and then they discovered that the alternative was actually better. And if it can happen to a commuter, I think it can happen to any of us in almost anything that we do. That shock lets us solve problems in a different way. Of course, there is nothing more disruptive than working with other people, as Kamal is probably finding already this evening. And there's a wonderful study done by Catherine Phillips, social psychologist, of problem solving in groups. Lots of studies of this, but I love Catherine Phillips's version. She asked groups of 4 people to solve a kind of murder mystery problem. They were given dossiers with information. They were, here's the alibis, here are the witness statements, here's what the police think, photos of the crime scene. Here are 3 people. Which of the 3 people committed the crime? So if you ask 4 friends to try and solve this problem, they have about a 50-50 success rate. It's quite a hard problem. I mean, chimpanzees have a 33% success rate because it's multiple choice. Four friends, 50% success rate. But in a randomized trial, she also asked 3 friends and a stranger to try to solve the problem. And when she asked 3 friends and a stranger, remember, the stranger's got no extra information. The stranger, the only thing about the stranger is it's kind of awkward when you're there with your three friends and this stranger suddenly shows up. The three friends and the stranger not only did better, they did enormously better. They had a 75% success rate. But what's really interesting, people were in total denial that this was true. So when Catherine Phillips interviewed them, the groups of four friends had a great time, not surprising. They also thought they'd solved the problem. When she interviewed the groups of three friends and the stranger, they had an awkward time. Of course, the whole thing was guaranteed, it was calculated to produce awkwardness. But not only did they not enjoy themselves, they thought they had done badly. So this is a group of people, objectively, far more successful. Subjectively, they think they're doing worse. And you can just imagine what that means for the way we react to diversity in all sorts of groups. You've got the awkward stranger in the room with you. You think that they are just getting in the way, and you don't realize they're actually helping you. And that's why the final perspective is so important, because I've been talking about all these disruptions that help us solve problems, but of course, none of them are things we embrace. We don't reformat our Kindles into Hattenschweiler. We don't jump for joy when a tube strike is announced. We don't habitually reach out to awkward strangers. This is not how we behave. So the rock and roll perspective is important here. When I was working on the book, one of the people I really wanted to speak to was a musician, and I didn't think I'd be able to persuade him to talk to me, but actually he was very, very willing because he finds randomness fascinating. His name is Brian Eno. Half of you are now going, who's Brian Eno? The other half are going, wow, Brian Eno, it's amazing. So Brian Eno is a very important figure in British music, but he's often in the background. He's this sort of zephyr of cerebral chaos, blowing backwards and forwards across the frontal lobes of pop. And he worked for Roxy. Yeah, he played the keyboards for Roxy Music with a big plastic knife and fork dressed as a wizard, but who didn't in those days? He created Another Green World, which is the album that Prince said, that's the best album I've ever heard. He created ambient music, but he's most famous for working with other musicians. Coldplay, U2, a gentleman called David Bowie. You may have heard of him. Eno and Bowie worked together on three of Bowie's greatest albums, the Berlin Trilogy, Low, Heroes, and Lodger. But why do all of these great musicians want to work with Brian Eno? It is because Brian Eno is the awkward stranger. It's because Brian Eno forces them to try to play the unplayable piano. He's the ugly font. He messes with them, and they know he's going to mess with them. And one of his favorite tools for messing with them is a deck of cards, which he calls the oblique strategies. And when everyone's stuck in the studio, he will just shuffle the cards, and he'll pull one out, and he will inflict its instructions on the musicians. So this one is change instrument roles. You've got one of the greatest guitarists in the world, you've got one of the greatest drummers in the world, but sadly the guitarist is on the drums and the drummer is on the guitar. It's the kind of thing Eno would do. In total darkness, or in a very large room, very quietly. Now, I don't know either, but this is what he would do to people. Make a sudden, destructive, unpredictable action. Incorporate. You see, the thing is, when it's on the cards, you kind of have to do it, even though you hate it. And they did hate it. They really hated it. Phil Collins played the drums on Another Green World. He was so angry, he was throwing beer cans across the studio in frustration. Carlos Alomar, great guitarist, played on the Berlin Trilogy. He would say, Brian, this experiment is stupid. This music sounds terrible. But you can't argue with the results. And in the end, the musicians came around. Sometimes it took 20 years. Sometimes it took 40 years. Carlos Alomar spoke to documentary makers about David Bowie, and he has this lovely line about the cards. He said, they took me to a new place. And to be honest, I didn't like that place. But then when I came back, I was fresh. So maybe there is something in them. And Carlos Alomar teaches guitar, and he gets his students to use the oblique strategies because he's realized something. Just because you don't like it, just because it makes you anxious, doesn't mean it isn't helping you. These cards were originally not a deck of cards at all. They were just a list on the wall of the studio. But that didn't work at all. Far too tidy, your bullet points. Eno would just go down the list, he'd pick whatever was fitting in with his plans anyway, whatever was least disruptive, and he'd do that. And he realized the resistance is so strong, we are never going to say yes to the mess unless we force ourselves. And maybe that is an effort of will. Maybe it's drawing a card at random from this mystical deck. Maybe it's a guilt trip from a German teenager. But whatever it takes, all of us from time to time, if we want to be more creative, if we want to solve problems, we need to try and sit down and play the unplayable piano. Thanks very much for listening.
All the way through that, Tim, I was feeling more and more anxious, more folded-armed, more kind of, we need some organization in here. So,
Good.
Audience, I'm going to come to you for questions during this, maybe randomly, who knows? And I might just pick people out to ask questions rather than doing the rather boring, organized hands-up thing. So just beware of that. I certainly would not be rude enough to ask Tim about the music to which he maybe conceived those wonderful children that were born to the great jazz pianist that you spoke to. But Tim, I just want to kick off, and I will sort of just think about a few things. Why are we
Everyone
so
is now
anxious?
Thinking of me conceiving my children. You
Yes.
realize that come
Yes.
up.
I'm trying to get over it by looking at the
yeah,
floor.
it's hard to imagine, but once you've started, it's hard to stop.
Yeah.
Focus.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Tim, why is it that people are anxious about disruption and about mess and about random events? And I'm just trying to think about my own work. I work in television, broadcasting, and online. When I started in my job, it took me bloody ages because I didn't know anything. I wasn't creative, I was rubbish. Now I'm at least a little more efficient and I can do things at least more quickly, which is good for the organization that I work for. Why does randomness make me almost shake with nerves?
Well, I think
I might just be weird, but as a human trait, order is very important to us.
I think order is important to us because, I don't want to open a bag of evolutionary psychology so early in the evening, but you know all this stuff about, is it a tiger or is it not a tiger? We're just being extremely alert to possible threats, I think, is highly adaptive. However, of course, in the modern world, most unexpected or unusual situations are not, in fact, threats. They're just Brian Eno or some other non-fatal thing, but we still have that adrenaline response. Now, Eno says that's exactly what you want. Of course, it makes you feel anxious, but it's that alertness that is the friend of your creativity. Of course, if you're completely in pieces, that's probably not helpful. But the extra energy from an unfamiliar situation is something you plow into your creative work. Whereas if you're feeling completely relaxed, you're bored. And if you're bored, you're not going to be doing good work. You may do quick work. And of course, some of what we do as economic journalists actually could be done by computers and shortly will be done by computers. And then we're back to the question of, well, you can't outcompete the computer by being faster. You've got to outcompete the computer by saying something more interesting, and maybe that does involve a little bit more randomness.
I did go through my sort of very organized, actually in Arial, bullet points that I've written down here in my neat manner. But actually, you do touch on so many vital themes that we are grappling with in this century. And I wanted to kick off with the one that I put at the top, which is politics. And you actually touch on, in your book, with a degree of perception, a certain Donald Trump, and why this book, written well before the actual presidential election, why Donald Trump might actually be bloody interesting and super successful. Now, given that he is now the president-elect, and as the BBC's economics editor, I have no opinions on that whatsoever. What is it about Mr. Trump, the president-elect, that is important for us to understand about his success?
Well, I think there are lots of things that are important for us to understand and lots of things we don't yet understand. But the point that I made in the book is that he used mess as a weapon very effectively. So this is not particularly unusual, particularly not for an underdog. It's hard to think of him as an underdog now because he's going to be the president. But he was a laughingstock a year and a half ago. He was going to beat Jeb Bush. He was going to beat Marco Rubio. Absurd, ridiculous. So he was a real underdog. And one of the things that he did very effectively was to keep changing the conversation faster than the Bush and Rubio and Kasich and so on spin machines could respond. So Bush would go away and talk to his focus groups and figure out the perfectly triangulated response in a very traditional political way that's always been effective before. But Trump had mortally offended 3 or 4 other ethnic groups before Bush could figure out how to respond to the first insult. And so he just left them looking incredibly ponderous. There is this famous incident where Rubio just started repeating himself just spurting out the same chunks of text, which made the point really drove home. But that was fatal for Rubio because it underlined something that was already going on. They were perceived as speaking from a script in a robotic way. Trump would just keep changing the conversation because he could, because he didn't care, he didn't have his focus groups.
But the point you made is important, that it was effective. Previous campaigns had supposedly been won on slick management, on single messages that you did not divert from, and on not creating controversies that the public would then reject. So something has happened there, hasn't it? Has something changed in the art of how we approach the world around us, which is something to do maybe with technology or the way we're now interconnected, which means that it's not about that we didn't really understand what mess was, but in previous iterations, mess didn't work.
I think things have changed. I'm not sure. Who knows? If Trump had come along 20 years ago, but we'd had 10 years of economic stagnation and 40 years of stagnating median incomes, and people were tremendously frustrated, and they saw American politics was dynastic, but we didn't have Twitter and Facebook. Would he have won? I don't know. There are many, many causes. Hillary Clinton's weakness as a candidate, the way the media behaved, the fact that he has access to Twitter, the economic background, the political background. There were lots of different things going on. So I can't.
But there was something, wasn't there, about the disruptive nature of him was an important part of all those different
of what was going on. Now, he's not the only person to have done this. So I make comparisons with Jeff Bezos of Amazon.
Yep.
I think they're not friends. So Jeff Bezos is probably not pleased with the comparison if he's noticed. But Bezos was, again, 20 years ago, setting up Amazon quite explicitly with the vision that if I am too careful and too slow because I try to get all the ducks in a row, Barnes & Noble will kill me. And however, if I move very, very quickly, yes, things will be chaotic, and I will have knives sliding down the chutes in the Amazon warehouse, and the sorting machine will be saying, is this knife a paperback or a hardback? And the warehouses will be choking on Jigglypuff toys, and we won't be set up, and it'll be terribly, terribly confusing. We'll lose lots of money, but it may be chaotic to us, but it'll be more chaotic for Barnes & Noble. He did that. Erwin Rommel, a German tank commander, did that. And in each of these cases, if you had gone into one of the organizations, if you'd been with Rommel's group in North Africa, with his Panzer Army in North Africa, if you'd been in the middle of the Trump campaign, if you had been in an Amazon warehouse or the Amazon management team, you would have said, God, this is a mess. This is a disaster.
Tell us about
if you had then gone and seen what they were doing to their opponents, you would have realized it's working, because their opponents are even more confused and even more panicking and flailing around.
Tell us about the Rommel example, because you go into it in quite a lot of detail about how small, nimble, as you say, one step ahead and confusing to the enemy can be a very powerful way of organizing against what is usually Barnes & Noble, the Clinton campaign machine, the Allied forces, often larger and, on paper at least, heavier opponents.
Yeah, and Rommel was definitely, like Trump, an underdog. We didn't see him as an underdog after he'd kind of beaten up the British Army repeatedly, but he was an underdog. He repeatedly, over the course of his career, both in the First World War and in the Second World War, would see opportunities and move very, very quickly to grab opportunities, even though his troops weren't ready. So the idea was, this opportunity is going to go away. We can't spare the time to get organized. We need to take the opportunity. And very often he would, by his rapid movement, confuse the enemy, which creates another opportunity. So then he'd move again, and again, and again. And sometimes they'd be marching through the night, they'd be sleep deprived, they'd be running out of fuel. This is his own troops. And yet the enemy might outnumber him 5-1, and yet be so bewildered that they surrendered. And there are so many different engagements in which Rommel was able to do this. So this was deciding that if I spare the time to get myself organized, I give my opponent the time to get organized too. And that's fatal. I would rather deal with the mess. I would rather deal with the chaos.
There is something about entrepreneurial spirit, is there, which needs an element of that mess of approach? Or is it something that has only helped certain people? Is Mark Zuckerberg messy? Is it a necessary part of the DNA of an entrepreneur or an inventor or the creator of great products, the notion of messiness, disruption, chaos?
I wouldn't go that far, although I wouldn't be surprised, but I can't prove it. The argument in the book, in general, by the way, is not that the chaotic approach or the messy approach is always the right approach. Structure often works very, very well. Structure is often
for books, particularly.
Yeah, I did consider writing a choose your own adventure chapter in almost random order, and I just ran out of time. I wish I'd had the chance to do it. The shipping container is a highly structured product. Globalization runs off it. I'm really glad that all the plugs are the same size and have the same voltage. That's helpful. There are lots and lots of ways in which structure helps us. Just the argument that I make in the book is we also apply structure in ways where it doesn't help us. And I suspect that for many entrepreneurs, trying to apply structure too early would be a mistake. And I suspect some of them try and realize it's a mistake. Some of them don't try at all. Obviously, if you're General Electric or IBM or Shell, you've got to have some kind of structure, and there are countervailing advantages.
There are. It's often the challenger brand that needs to have the chaos. So it's Rommel against the British Army. It's Amazon against Barnes & Noble. Yeah. I used to be head of news at The Observer. It was The Observer against the Sunday Times. We needed to have something in our DNA that wasn't the market leader, like Virgin against British Airways, Orange against Vodafone. It's a usual way for the underdog to operate.
It is often, and Tyson Fury against Vladimir Klitschko as well is another example in the book. Rocky as well.
Yes.
So
Southpaw. It was about Southpaw, was it? Somebody throwing in.
So as you all know, one of the great movies, Rocky. Actually, no, I think it's Rocky 2. It's Rocky 2. Got to get it right. Rocky's.
Any role in conception at all? Any of that music, or?
I think
it's too much information, sorry, I didn't really.
In Rocky 5, I think there is a training montage of all the previous training montages. Whoa. There's kind of a meta montage, but we digress. So in Rocky 2, he's, if I remember, he boxes southpaw, so he leads with the left, but he's trained to fight leading with the right. And he fights Apollo Creed, the whole fight leading with the right, even though that's not his favored style, which confuses Creed. And then right at the end of the fight, he switches and he leads southpaw, which is how he's been trained, how he's used to be fighting. And the confusion, it cannot have made him a better boxer, but it made him a more confusing boxer. Now I thought, gosh, well, that's a great Hollywood plot, but it would never happen in reality. And then this guy called Tyson Fury came along, won the European Championship doing almost exactly the same thing, switched from leading with the right to leading with the left in round 3. And just dragged his opponent down to a really appalling level. And it was a terrible, terrible fight, but Tyson Fury won, and then did the same to Klitschko as well.
Yep.
And the commentator said, I can't understand it. Klitschko's normally a much better boxer than this, but Tyson Fury managed to make him look bad. And often these messy strategies, they make Hillary Clinton look bad, they make Jeb Bush look bad, they make Montgomery look bad, they drag your opponent down to your level and below.
And you lose confidence almost.
Yeah, because you don't know what's going on.
And you lose your judgment.
Yeah.
You talk a lot in the book about automation. Automation, artificial intelligence, the growth of data organizing our world. I did come here on the tube. I came on the Central Line. It wasn't too bad. I then could get my phone out and it told me which way to walk from Lancaster Gate down through the park, even though some of the park was closed because it was dark. I could see another route and I just walked down and I knew exactly how long it would take me. Very, very organized. Good. But is automation damaging our ability to be messy?
What worries me about the automation is what happens when it fails. Whether automation damages our ability to be messy or not depends on the circumstance. In some cases, technology can help us be more messy. For example, Hollywood movies, comedies, they're all improvised now. Why are they improvised? Because it's much easier to film digitally and it's much easier to edit digitally. And so the technology lets you make more mess and still deliver a product that works for the audience. So you sort of take away the scaffolding in the end. Where in the old days when you were filming on old-fashioned film and when editing is a lot more difficult, you have to do all your messy work with a script and then the actors aren't able to improvise. So technology can free us to improvise. But the automation chapters in the book look at something called the paradox of automation. The paradox of automation is that it supports us and helps us make decisions and helps us be safer, helps us get to our destination more quickly. And then at the moment when the automation fails, because everything fails from time to time, that is the moment when we're in trouble. Because if you'd been in the middle of the park and you didn't have a map, you hadn't looked at a map, you hadn't taken in what the surroundings were like, you might have really been stuck at that point because you were trusting Google to get you there. Now, there's an example I give in the book. There are lots of hilarious GPS gone wrong stories in the book of people driving into the Pacific Ocean following their GPS and so on because they trust the computer. But there's a not terribly funny story in the book of 3 pilots crashing a perfectly good plane into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and killing everybody on board. And it was because their automation failed in quite a subtle way. And they should still have been perfectly capable of flying the plane. And yet, because they didn't fully understand, they'd really been de-skilled, they didn't understand the situation, they didn't understand how the automation had failed. And one error led to another. So the paradox of automation is the better the machines get, the safer the autopilot gets, the more bewildered we are in the very rare occasions that it does fail. Now, I don't have a brilliant answer to this because, just to be clear, autopilots are very safe. Planes are much safer than they used to be. 2009, when that plane crashed, was one of the safest years in aviation history. So I'm not saying do away with autopilot. I am saying, is there a better way for us to work with the machines so that we're able to maintain our skills a little bit more? And there are some suggestions of that. So there's some work on weather forecasters, which suggests that the weather forecaster can forecast the weather manually or use the computer. The best way to do it is for the weather forecast to forecast manually and then ask the computer to check. But what we tend to do, because it's easier, is get the computer to make the forecast and then manually check. But then the manual check is useless because you start to get really sloppy and you don't really have a lot of skills. So if the autopilots were babysitting the humans, we might have safer planes. At the moment, we have the humans babysitting the computers, which is bizarre. Because you can guarantee when the computer fails, the human will not know what's going on.
It's one of the most thrilling parts of the book for very serious reasons, that Flight 447, the Air France disaster that you detail.
I wrote the final draft of that on a plane, which took nerves of steel, I have to say. It wasn't a lot of fun.
And as you say, and maybe just to give the audience a bit more of the feel of that time, they were getting audio messages from the autopilot about the plane stalling. And actually, their response was the opposite to what they should have been doing. So rather than trying to get the plane to decline and pick up speed so it could start pull out of the stall, they kept lifting the nose. Again, Tim, why is it in our nature to sort of blindly start sort of trying to do something which is actually the wrong thing. Because when you're reading your book, you're thinking, how can that have happened?
Yeah.
That they are trying to do what is clearly the wrong thing.
I think in that particular case, the only experience that those men had of flying that plane by themselves was at sea level. So when they were taking off and landing, they would do take-off and landing maneuvers all the time, manually. And what's different about that is that the air is much thicker when you're taking off and landing. And also, if something goes wrong when you're coming in for a landing, what you do is you yank back on the joystick and you pull up, and it's called pull up and go around. There's a toga, take off, go around. So that was the only thing they had. That was the emergency procedure that was hardwired into them, because they had no practice in flying above the storm across the Atlantic, and because the autopilot always did it. And when the autopilot disengaged because of a very small fault and just said, oh, well, we just de-iced this sensor, you guys fly the plane, the young pilot was feeling nervous. There's a storm ahead of him. He feels like he wants to fly over the storm. It feels safer. Take off, go around. And so the plane pulls up, but there's not enough air to do that. And so the plane just starts to mash all the way down through the storm. But he keeps feeling the plane is falling. I need to save it. And he's pulling up, because he's never practiced this. He's never practiced it because the autopilot always did it.
You talk about there, Tim, in the book, about what you call erosion of judgment, that we are not put in enough testing situations. Now, when flying a plane, that is obviously catastrophic. There are, of course, big debates at the moment about self-driving cars, which you also talk about in your book. Given that 5-10 years' time, we may well be in largely automated vehicles traveling at relatively high speed. What are your concerns about that approach? Is that going to erode our ability to drive in an emergency? And when you're sitting in the back of your car having a coffee and reading your great book, of course, and your car's driving along and suddenly something goes wrong and your car's sort of veering off, I wouldn't know how to drive anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's not going to work. So they're going to have to be good enough that if the model is the human takes over in an emergency, forget it. And weirdly,
but that is the model. Yeah, appears to be.
Yeah, it's not going to work. It can't work. Unless your definition of emergency is, I see a long time in advance that there seems to be some kind of situation, and I'm just going to slow right down, maybe pull over, and invite the human to drive. Yeah, maybe. But the idea you look up from your newspaper and suddenly there's a bus coming towards you, it's clearly not going to work. And I mean, it's weird that anybody thinks that this will work. So what does work is if the cars get good enough that we're willing to hand over control completely, and we just say, well, they will sometimes crash, but then again, humans sometimes crash too.
But they'll crash less often than they did under human control.
Maybe. So we hope that. I think it's plausible they will eventually get back.
Like autopilot.
But the other thing that potentially works is the human drives and the autopilot babysits, which you sort of get a little bit already. You now get some cars will brake automatically, will give you lane guidance, will tell you appear to be falling asleep, will tell you you're an idiot and keep your eyes on the road, that kind of thing. That works, because there the human is maintaining his or her skills, and yet you've got the computer babysitting. Computers can babysit because computers don't get tired or bored or de-skill. In fact, everything you do, the computer's learning from. But yeah, that's going to be the model. I'm sure it'll come. I'm sure we'll get self-driving cars at some stage. I don't know when. Maybe it's very soon. But yeah, this model that the human is the emergency backup cannot work.
Yeah, it's the wrong way around. You talk, one of the most interesting debates you've sparked is the notion of the messy desk and the obsession many businesses had for a long time. You tell a hilarious story about BHP Billiton's facilities management having long memos about how big the photo frame you could have on your desk with your family picture in it and where it had to stand and what you had to do.
Yeah, and if you get a certificate of achievement, you can have that framed on your desk, but only if you remove the family photo. So you're punished for getting your certificate of achievement by removing your family.
Where did all that come from?
I think it came from... there have always been control freaks, so there's that. But I think that more recently what we've seen is the spread of kind of quality management techniques from the production line. So Toyota and the 5S system, was it the 4S's? I lose track, and Six Sigma, that all these that General Electric advocate. And these are all tactics designed to, or approaches designed to produce very, very high reliability in precision engineering or in, say, an operating theatre. So, yeah, if you are making silicon chips, or you are making cars, or you are doing brain surgery, you want a very, very well-drilled team. You don't want any mess. You don't want any randomness. You want a checklist, and everything needs to work. And then what happens is, as I describe in other fields of life, we take a perfectly good idea, and then we say, wouldn't it be great if this also governs the way that people organize their desks? For no reason. There is no reason. When you talk to these companies, they're like, well, you know, tidy desks are more professional. Are they? I know some very professional people with some very messy desks. Tidy desks present a cleaner image. Oh, so you're saying tidy desks look tidy? Okay, I agree. Why is that good? Now, the research that really changed the way I view the universe was done by these two psychologists, Alex Haslam and Craig Knight. And they got people to do office tasks in an artificial office. So they'd come in and, you know, they'd do email, do some crosswords or whatever, do some stuff, file these papers. There were it was a randomized trial, 4 different branches to the trial. So in one branch, the office is super minimalist. People, that was fine, it wasn't great. Second branch, the office is what they called enriched. There's a pot plant, there are nice kind of Georgia O'Keeffe-esque pictures on the wall. It's fine. And people quite like that. So enriched was better than minimal. But this was what was really interesting. It didn't really matter how the office looked. What mattered was who had control. So in the third treatment of this randomized trial, they call it the empowered condition. So in the empowered condition, you get your Georgia O'Keeffe-ish posters, you get your pot plants, and they're like, well, where do you want to put them? Put them anywhere you like, or if you want to take them away, we'll take them away. Fine. People loved it. They did incredibly well. They were very happy. They got more crosswords done. They did more tasks. Then the fourth condition was called the disempowered condition. Evil genius. So in the disempowered condition, what happens is you tell people, here's the pot plant, here are the paintings, do what you like, set them all up. So people would do all that. They're just ready to sit down and do some work. And then the experimenter would come in and say, oh, I'm sorry, this is not appropriate for the experiment. And we then rearrange them and put them back how they were in the enriched treatment. Now remember, in the enriched treatment, people were perfectly happy. But in the disempowered treatment, which is physically identical, people, they hated it. And they hated it from every possible angle. They hated the company, they hated the office, they hated the task. They really hated the experimenter. And I realized it's not about, you know, some people have tidy desks, some people have messy desks. That's fine, whatever suits. But the idea that in a regular office environment, not a production line, not an operating theatre, but in a regular office environment, a manager will come in and say, put that away, you're only allowed one of those paintings, you can't do that, this is violating company policy. That is causing the most profound resentment. For what? To give the manager a sense of control.
If you're thinking about how offices are designed now, we have had this obsession. Well, firstly, there was the tidy desk obsession. And then there's this notion that much commented on in that hilarious comedy W1A about the BBC, that no one actually has a desk, and you just walk around with a laptop and sit wherever on a sort of soft sofa somewhere, and it all looks lovely and gorgeous. In terms of the psychology of an office, is that the wrong approach to take?
I think the...
'Cause it's quite messy, but it's disempowering.
It's highly disempowering, and there's a real focus there on things looking cool. So again, it's a sort of it's a surface over substance thing, and people don't have the sense of control. So what I think people actually need is the ability to create an oasis where they can operate without interruptions. And they also need a place where they can collaborate. Of course, it depends exactly on the kind of task, depends on the team. But the problem with the BBC in particular, which I know quite well, not as well as you do, but I do go there a lot, is that it's full to bursting, and therefore, so your license fee is hard at work. I can vouch for that. But it means there's nowhere to go if you need to have a phone call, if you need to think. There are these pods, but the pods are always full because there's somebody there with a laptop because they can't find a desk. So these things don't work. And there's a long history of this, going back to the guy who originally invented the Open Plan Office, who was Jay Chiat of Chiat Day, the coolest advertising agency in the world, who created this amazing Open Plan Office designed by Gaetano Pesce and Frank Gehry. Frank Gehry, before he designed the Guggenheim, designed the first Open Plan Office. And it was beautiful, and the magazines came, and they took these, and all the design magazines and these double-page color spreads of how amazing it looked. But the thing was, Jay Chiat, the boss, had to, in order to make it work the way he thought it would work, it was going to work, he had to go around and physically move people on, because they were trying to sort of get these piles of paper, and here are my piles of paper, and I'm trying to do some work, and Jay Chiat would come along and say, you were sitting here yesterday, and this is a paperless office. Get rid of those pieces of paper. So he had this vision, a highly designed vision, and that's just not compatible with how ordinary people work. And when ordinary people work, they kind of make a mess, and that's fine.
Where's the best place you've been in?
To me, control is very important. And so what I like is the fact that I personally, right now, am very, very lucky because I can go and work at the FT, I can go and work at the BBC, I can go and work in Starbucks. Well, I would never do that because the coffee is disgusting. I can go and work in the Bodleian Library because I live in Oxford and I have a library pass, so I can work in any library in Oxford. It's an absolutely amazing privilege. Now, what I find is that sometimes I want to be in a cafe, sometimes I want to be in a library, sometimes I need a fast internet connection, sometimes the internet is not my friend, the internet is what is preventing me from getting any work done. I can choose any of these things, and it's down to me. And I realize not everybody, I realize I'm enormously lucky in that respect, but I think a lot of offices could nudge a little bit more in that direction of giving people a little bit more freedom, a little bit more control over their environment. And yet, actually, what we do is we see the exact opposite. You know, we try to inflict environments on people in the name of efficiency and often tax deductibility. The cubicle, by the way, very space efficient, but also tax deductible because it's furniture rather than architecture, and therefore it's tax advantaged. So this was one of the reasons why the cubicle sprang to life.
You talk about the notion of the chance encounter. What is the best way for serendipity to flourish in organizations? What's the best way to meet new people and hear new ideas? Before I go to the audience, after this will be my last question, if I were, by chance, looking for a girlfriend, what would be the best way for me to do that?
So,
and I will be coming to the audience with this question.
Sometimes, you know, it's important to seize the opportunity and to improvise. So I would just like to ask, if Kamal was looking for a girlfriend, anybody free for a drink later? Anyone? Gentleman there.
Yep.
You've got to be flexible in this life.
But tell me, Tim, seriously, no, not how would I get a girlfriend, but it's the notion of people, again, your notion of the murder mystery.
Yeah.
People felt uncomfortable with the stranger. And there are huge advantages with working with a group of people that you feel understand you. You maybe don't want to be friends, but you want to have a sort of a focused purpose maybe in what you're doing. Why is it that, again, to sort of go full circle, do we find that notion of pushing ourselves out to meet random people? You've got the great example in your book of people going to networking events and speaking to people they know at a networking event.
Yes. Having explicitly said
gone there
to
meet new people.
I'm here to meet new people, but the researchers put these little tracking tags on them, and so they were able to see who talked to whom. And it's one of the best titles ever. The title of the research paper is "Do People Mix at Mixers?" No.
Yeah.
So
there's something in our nature, again, just to finish off on that, there is something in our nature, familiarity, order possibly out of that is very important.
And I feel this very strongly. This is the advice that I give people in the book that I personally find hardest to take because I'm very shy. And I don't like to meet new people. And yet I know that if I can actually reach out and connect with somebody new and have a conversation with someone new and really, and it's not a superficial conversation, but you really feel that you're getting to know another human being and there's a meeting of minds, that's the most thrilling experience in the world. And yet I find it incredibly difficult to do that. So it's tough. On the subject of the girlfriend, what I found interesting in recent years is the way that we have put our trust in computer algorithms to find us a match. And this I find absolutely bizarre. Internet dating itself makes perfect sense. Obviously, you can meet people online, nothing wrong with that. But the promise of internet dating, and this, right back to the very early days, I write about the very first internet date, well, not even internet dating, the very first computerized dating at Harvard in the 1960s. They were saying, the computer will find the perfect person for you. Actually, all they were doing was matching for sort code. So this is somebody who, for zip code. This is somebody who lives near you, put them together. And it worked brilliantly, but the reason it worked brilliantly is because people would show up for the date and they would go, I wonder why the computer matched us. And they would spend the whole date trying to figure out what they had in common. It was actually fantastic. There's a more recent study by OkCupid where they told people they were incredibly good matches, but actually they were incredibly bad matches, according to OkCupid's algorithm. It made absolutely no difference. And the reason is obvious when you think about it. Think about all of the things. Picture your perfect girlfriend, Kamal. All of the things you want to...
Well, he's over there.
This could be your lucky night, sir. You picture this person in your mind, and all of the things that you want, and then you think about all the things that you could actually write down and check off a computer. So, things like hobbies, languages, interested in economics, that kind of thing. Gender is one thing that at least some people will allow to be sort of pinned down by a computer. But in most cases, what you actually want cannot be quantified. It can't be parsed by a computer. And yet somehow we want to believe that the computer can do it. So it's just one of those cases where actually we need to let go. We need to expose ourselves to new experiences. You've done that tonight, Kamal, so well done. And you never know, this could be
my lucky night.
Could be the beginning of something beautiful.
Okay, let's have some questions. And you, sir, are going to ask the first one. This man down here, my new life partner. It's lovely that you can all come to our, well, it won't be a wedding. It'll be a sort of, what would it be? I don't know. It'll be something lovely. So he's going to ask the first question over there. Fabulous. And then there's a gentleman here. Lovely. Yes.
The real answer
I need to know your name, obviously.
I'm David.
Hello, David.
If you had come out for a drink with me afterwards, I would have helped you find your life partner.
Oh, right.
Your girlfriend. And that was the bit of chaos that you should have seized on.
Well, I haven't not seized it yet.
I don't really have a question.
A question for Tim.
Tim, do you think it's, with these messy people that you're looking at, do you think you've got the, I mean, what would you say to say that you've got the cause and effect the right way around? Maybe the type of people who become messy are just naturally successful rather than they're successful because they're messy.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right to raise the question. I actually don't, in the book, I don't make the argument, which a lot of people do say. You see it online, there are lots of articles online that say, messy people are more creative. I actually don't ever make the argument that messy people are more creative. I don't have any proof that messy people are more creative. What I do make the argument, and I made it in my opening remarks, is that messy situations can provoke anybody to be more creative, or not even necessarily more creative. And if you find a better route to commute, an act of creativity, well, maybe it is, but actually I just think of it as problem solving. So there are some very, very creative and very, very messy people. Agatha Christie's a wonderful example. She just used to randomly shuffle her notebooks, and they just have these plot ideas, and then it'd be like, buy salt, buy pepper, buy toilet paper, maybe killed with arsenic. So she was utterly chaotic, but that's not an argument that I make, and I'm not sure the data would back me up. So it's not that messy people are creative people, it's that messy situations can provoke any of us to solve problems and to find creative solutions.
There's a gentleman here, and a gentleman there, and then a woman in front. Great.
You may have sort of gone in this direction already, but I was interested to see what your thoughts were about how messy meets what some would say is an over-regulated world. Because it's okay in an office to have a slightly OCD situation potentially, but if it's a whole trading block or something like that, have you got any thoughts about that side of things?
Regulation. So I talk in the book about a couple of different types of regulation. I talk about vehicle emission standards, and I talk about banking capital regulation. And what I argue is that the regulators fell into the trap of a very, very nice, tidy, long checklist. If you can meet all of these requirements, then we'll pass you, fit to drive your car or fit to be a bank. But unfortunately, these checklists don't actually catch wrongdoing. They don't make banks safe because they're always able to be gamed. Andy Haldane, chief economist at the Bank of England, a few years ago, really dropped a bomb in the middle of a central bankers conference at Jackson Hole when he demonstrated that a very, very crude rule of thumb was far, far better than this incredibly tiny, nitpicking checklist at identifying which banks had got into trouble during the financial crisis. And he told me, I wasn't quite as excited about interviewing Andy as I was about interviewing Brian Eno, but I was still excited to interview him because he's a very interesting thinker. He said, I would rather have a SWAT team of regulators randomly showing up at banks and asking weird questions than an army of box tickers. But unfortunately, the regulatory regime is moving far more towards the army of box tickers and away from the SWAT team. And we saw this with vehicle emissions, where you had incredibly rigorous, tight regulations on vehicle emissions, but sadly they were incredibly predictable, and so the automakers just cheated. And if they'd been a little bit slacker, but also random, so we're not going to tell you exactly how we're going to test the car or exactly what conditions under which we're going to test the car, there's no way VW would have been able to get away with what they did.
A lot of that is about public desire for rules and regulations that you can then be caught out breaking.
Yes, and it enables the regulators to say, look, we did everything right, here's our checklist, we did all of this, rather than, trust us, we're going to just show up at a random time and ask some awkward questions. We're like, well, it's much harder for the regulator later to say, we did the right thing, we asked the right questions, so that it doesn't leave a paper trail.
Yeah. So,
I'm not sure if you read the book by an American psychologist called The Dice Man.
I have, yes. Yeah.
The premise is that he throws dice and it determines what he's going to do. Well, I practiced this with a friend of mine.
keep the mic up there, yep.
We practiced this with a friend of mine and we decided which bar we were going to go into. And the friend of mine I was with ended up meeting his wife as a result. Which would never have gone into that bar otherwise.
You must give me that book, actually. I need that. Yeah.
So I'm glad your friend had better luck than Luke Reinhardt, the Dice Man anti-hero, who I seem to remember committed a number of sexual offences and various serious crimes over the course of his dicing activity. So I wouldn't necessarily endorse that approach. But what I would endorse is a little bit more randomness in life. You don't necessarily have to say, will I commit this ghastly crime or not? But you can say, here are 6 things I kind of want to do, but I've been a bit reluctant to do, and I'm going to write them all down, give them a number, roll the dice, and I'll do one of them this weekend. And as with Brian Eno's oblique strategies, the fact that you're sort of letting go a little bit lets you push your own boundaries a bit further. So in moderation, I think it's a good approach, and I'm very glad it worked for your friend. Well, assuming he's very happily married. I mean, it could have been a total disaster for all I know, but let's leave it there.
Yeah, madam. Sorry, there's a lady down here, and then there's a woman over there, yes, with the glasses, thanks.
I suppose you sort of answered this in the last question, but, we don't all have a tube strike or Donald Trump or those things happening in our lives on a daily basis. And
we do all have Donald Trump.
Unfortunately, we have Donald Trump. But, if you look at whether it's your personal life or your work life, it's very difficult to create that stranger in the room from thin air, and you don't know who or what that stranger might be. So how exactly would you suggest to sort of bring that sort of catastrophic elbow, or not, to get you to move?
Well, we managed to create a tall, dark, handsome stranger for Kamal already, so it can be done just almost out of thin air. The dice idea works. I think if you find it difficult, which I do, it's worth sort of maybe saying, okay, once a month, I am going to commit to going to do a new thing. I'm going to go to a new place. I'm going to try a new activity. I'm going to ask a friend of mine to introduce me to a friend of theirs, and just get out a little bit more. There's a rule of thumb I heard recently, which is go to the party. If you're in doubt as to whether to go to the party, go to the party. It's advice I find tremendously difficult to take because we economists don't do parties. So, well, I speak for myself, possibly.
We're a bloody laugh when we get there, though.
Yeah, we really are. You're just looking for those ways to push your boundaries and to leave a little bit of room for discovery. It's very easy to overschedule your time. If you book a holiday, of course you're in a new situation. It's very, very easy to overschedule a holiday. So you get on TripAdvisor and you can plan this and you can plan that and you can do everything via the internet, which previously you would have had to have shown up and seen what was available. But now you can, if you want, schedule everything. And I think it's probably not a great idea to give into that temptation. There's some interesting suggestive evidence on that if you do that, you actually, your holiday passes more quickly, you have less rich memories of it, because you've kind of been anticipating it already, and then it's all kind of a bit of a routine once you get into it. Whereas if you don't know quite what you're going to do that day, you don't know quite where you're going to go, you've got that alertness that Brian Eno talked about. It's strange, it's unfamiliar, it's a little bit risky, and then therefore it's much, much more interesting, and your brain is paying more attention, which means you're developing richer memories. But yeah, you don't want to do this every day. I did ask Eno, how often do you use the cards? And he said, oh yeah, you wouldn't want to use them as on a routine basis. Only when you get stuck. I said, well, how often do you get stuck? He said, oh, all the time.
Is it important for organizations to deliberately create a little bit of chaos within them? You talk about flexible, what is it? You've talked about flexible attention.
Yes.
Where you try and disrupt processes to see if you can serendipitously sort of invent something new almost.
There is a tension because, of course, you can go way too far and as we've seen, you can cause a lot of resentment if you're constantly trying to control people. But one thing that several innovative organizations do is to move people through different departments. So 3M, for example, is very highly respected for its innovation. They will rotate people from one department to another. And the idea is, okay, you might feel out of your comfort zone, you might be a specialist in CAT scanning, and suddenly you're in the adhesives department. But you'll either bring something to the adhesives department or you'll learn something from the adhesives department. And if you don't, well, it doesn't matter. You can go back to CAT scanning at some stage. So there is that idea of rotating from one project to another, which, by the way, is the habit of lots and lots of different studies of this. Highly successful scientists and artists all have multiple projects on the go, and they're rotating from one to another. They do it naturally.
Yeah, madam there.
Thank you. My question actually follows on directly from that. It seems that a lot of active thought goes into being messy, and I just wonder whether you thought by being fully aware of your messiness, you actually create more positive effects than if you just randomly happen to be quite a messy person in your approach.
I think it does help to be mindful, and I have, in what is a year that has been full of disruption, it has been helpful from time to time to be able to go, well, Brexit seems like the unplayable piano to me, but you never know. We might get a beautiful tune out of it, and just to be not constantly blindly optimistic, because sometimes a disaster is just a disaster. But to be, I mean, I really felt this. I was in Washington 3 days after Donald Trump was elected, and talking about messy. And it's one thing to say, well, look for the opportunities, and you never know something. But if you're dealing with people who are not white and not male and are in tears in a public space because they feel so threatened by what has happened, you can't just go, hey, look on the bright side, this could be the unplayable piano. Sometimes things are just bad, and we need to acknowledge that. But yeah, to be constantly telling yourself, okay, calm down, pay attention, there might be something interesting here, I think is a skill worth developing. David Bowie apparently had this uncanny knack being able to put to one side something was nearly perfect and nearly finished because some interesting mistake had just happened. And to be able to say, that is what we should be paying attention to, because that is far more interesting than this nearly finished piece of music, which we can always come back to. And Eno said that was extremely rare and extremely brave, but that's one of the things that made Bowie the great artist that he was.
Sir, at the back there, yeah.
Hi. So you mentioned earlier that it was more about messy situations than it was about messy minds. Some of the most famous disruptors in the world are the opposite of messy minds. People like Steve Jobs and Ron McLaren or Dyson, when they're obsessed with doing things in a particular way. Do you think there's a multiplier effect? So a mind like that in a messy situation makes them more successful. As Bowie as well, he was an obsessive.
So I've only seen one photograph of Steve Jobs' office. It was pretty messy, I have to say. So we always need to be careful. Yes, he liked beautiful objects and he didn't like untidy detailing on Apple's products, but that didn't mean that his working process was necessarily incredibly organized and tidy. Jobs, I think, there's an interesting story about Jobs that I tell in the book about his attempt. This comes back to what you were saying, Kamal, about organizing offices. His attempt to design the Pixar offices. So he was the majority shareholder in Pixar, the film studio that created Toy Story and Finding Nemo and all these great films. And so Jobs really wanted a hand in how this office worked. And he came up with this idea that all the toilets in this building were going to be centrally located in the lobby. Well, just off the lobby, obviously. But you were going to have this pair of huge kind of toilets, and basically what would happen is the shared human need to urinate would bring Pixar's employees down to the lobby, and they'd kind of mingle with each other and meet people, and it'd be great.
After washing their hands, hopefully.
After washing their hands, always wash your hands. So what was interesting, though, is he had this idea, and he felt it very strongly, because serendipity is incredibly important. And he's right, of course. And then there was this rebellion in Pixar, led by, any guesses? Pregnant women, of course, because they don't see the serendipity so much as they see it's a 15-minute walk to the toilet, and will therefore basically be walking to and from the toilet the entire day. So they protested, and there was this big staff meeting, and Jobs, of course, got this reputation as being a control freak, the control freak's control freak. He did something remarkable. He backed down. He said, okay, I understand. You're the people who work here. It's not my office. It's my project, but it's not my office. And so he backed down, and he said, I will find some other way to foster serendipity in Pixar. And apparently, if you visit the Pixar offices, they are this absolute riot of creativity. So one of the desks is like a Disney princess castle, and another one is a jungle, and another one is a cave, and they're all sort of carved out of polystyrene and lovingly painted. And they've even commandeered air conditioning vents and turned them into secret passages into hidden cocktail lounges. And it's an absolute mess. And of course, it's a wonderfully creative place. And Jobs, I think to his enormous credit, saw that at a certain point, he had to let go.
Gentleman there, and the gentleman down here. Who's up at the back there? Yep.
Now that we mainly use a single tool, a laptop or a phone, what's the digital equivalent of a messy desk?
So there's a psychologist called Steve Whitaker, who used to work for Lotus and for AT&T, and now is at UC Santa Clara, who has just published a book which I recommend for nerds. It's really nerds only. But nerds, any nerds? Among friends. It's called The Science of Managing Our Digital Stuff. And what he does is he looks at how we manage paper documents, digital documents, email, photographs, all of these things that come into our devices, our computers, or across our desks, and notes the similarities and differences and the filing strategies that people use, and why some of those strategies work and some of those strategies don't work. And it does depend exactly how, what sort of stuff you're filing. But he finds that often a pretty messy approach works rather well. So if you are, say, dealing with financial data, and it's coming in, it's highly structured, it's highly organized, you need a good filing system. Because the data comes in, it's already organized, keep it organized, don't make a mess. That works very well. But for most of us, the documents that come into our lives, paper, digital, email, they don't have a good structure. They're not very well organized. And so Whitaker has identified people who try to file everything, put all the email in folders, put all the paper in manila files, file it all away. And he's compared that strategy with a strategy of just kind of letting it pile up. And what he finds is that the filers don't do as well as the pilers, generally. The pilers do very well because they have a sense of where everything is. They can see it. They can see their inbox. They can see, you can have too much of a good thing, of course. You don't want too much in your inbox, but you can see a lot of stuff. You can see piles of paper on your desk. You know where they are. And a pile of paper on your desk is actually self-organizing. So you pull something out of the pile of paper, you look at it, you put it back on the top. You find something else, you look at it, you work on it, you put it back on the top. Well, what's going on? Recency means that the stuff you've looked at recently is on top of the pile. The stuff you haven't looked at recently is on the bottom of the pile. It turns out this is, in fact, an algorithm from computer science. It works incredibly well. Your pile of paper is self-organizing using the least recently used rule, which is very powerful. So it's not random. It's actually subtly and organically organized. Now, what about the filers? You would think, well, okay, the pile of paper's fine, but the filers must be better. They're filing their email, they're filing their paper documents, they must be doing better. Turns out there is such a thing as premature filing. And Whitaker has identified this, and so premature filing, what's happened is, unlike the person dealing with the highly organized financial data, the stuff comes in, you don't know where it belongs. You don't know, do I file this under kind of, I could file it under boss, or maybe I need to start a new project document, or maybe this goes under departmental structure, and you don't know quite where to put it. And if you file it away too quickly, it's very tidy because you don't see it anymore. It's not in your inbox, not on your desk, but you don't really know what it is or where it is. And a month later, when you try to understand your filing system, it makes no sense to you whatsoever. Whereas if you just leave it for a while, a lot of the stuff gets deleted. That's what the pilers do very well. They just delete loads of stuff. Because, oh, this crap at the bottom of my pile, throw it in the bin. You know, or dump all that email, it's not relevant anymore. But the stuff they do file, they understand it. They know where it belongs. They can file it in a sensible way, and they can access it again. So the messy pilers actually have smaller and better organized archives in a supreme irony. So yeah, Steve Whitaker, it's great stuff.
So,
hi. So, I'm not a fan of being messy, just as a starter for 10. But I think there's this bit of filing some of your stuff away. You know, there's so much more we've got going on. We don't have time. Freeing your headspace up, some of your desk space up, what's in front of you, so that you can be creative, you can actually think of stuff and move forward. What are your thoughts on that there is this sort of balance or a view that actually having some sort of order around you so you can think straight and move forward and have some clarity has got some legs, rather than the opposite?
Yes, I think there's definitely something in that. I'm quite a tidy person generally. If you see my house, if you went to my kitchen, you'd say it's a tidy kitchen. If you went to my bedroom, should you be so lucky, sir, you would say this is a tidy bedroom. But if you saw my desk, you'd go, well, this guy's medium messy. And it's to do with the nature of the problem. In the kitchen, the glasses go in the glasses place, and the corkscrew goes in the corkscrew drawer, and everything has a place. But the flow of information across my desk and into my inbox, it doesn't have a place. As with the Steve Whitaker's research, it doesn't have a place until I've had some time to think about it. Now, everyone has to find their own way of processing information. I find that when I have a clear desk, I have a clear mind, and I feel kind of productive. But I think that there is a reverse causation going on, which is I only have a clear desk when things are really quiet and nothing's going on. Then I clear my desk, and I feel kind of calm. And when my desk is very messy, I feel stressed, but I think I'm feeling stressed because I haven't had time to tidy my desk. So, you know, I think we get cause and effect mixed up. A final thought. I'm quite a fan of David Allen's book, Getting Things Done. So David Allen basically says you need a sense of where everything, all the things that you have to do, you need to capture somewhere. you can't just let them float around in your mind. They need to be written down, and they need to be written down somewhere where you feel you can understand them. But what Alan argues is at that point, you've got a tremendous amount of space to improvise at that point. So you're not blocking out every hour in your diary or every minute in your diary. You're not saying, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this. And there's some great research I describe in the book. That is a completely disastrous way to organize your day. Instead, what you're doing is putting it somewhere where you feel you understand what it is, but you're not trying to over-organize, you're not trying to over-structure, and then you can start improvising and saying, I feel like doing this, I feel like doing that. So structures can help, for sure. Structures can help. But let's use them only when they're helpful and not try and impose them on situations where they don't work at all.
Now, as an organizer, I'm very worried about the time, so we're going to get 3 quick bullet points from this gentleman here, a gentleman there, and a gentleman there, and then that's going to be your final thoughts, Tim. Sir.
Thank you very much.
Quickly.
You make a very powerful argument that random, unanticipated events help the creativity of the individual. And I was wondering how that translates to a team, because the sports teams that are successful do their very best to actually refine and get rid of all the variables that are unpredicted. And as I was thinking as you spoke, how many random, unanticipated events would, say, a team of politicians trying to run a country find helpful?
Yeah, brilliant. Just Tim, let's hang on to that thought. Gentleman there. That's sort of the David Brailsford incremental advantage of the cycling team. Yep.
Thank you. You've got this amazing body of work now, Tim, all the way for the last, 15 years or so, going all the way back to your early papers. Including Messi, what are the 3 things we absolutely need to take away from Adapt and Messi and all these other great books?
Okay, all the other books he wants to sell tonight, that's good. Okay. And the gentleman, is that actually your agent? And a gentleman at the back there.
Hi, I'm a state schools teacher. I spend most of my day, too much of my day, drilling students with model responses for questions they mostly know in advance. I'm intrigued by the notion of having a random GCSE and whether you think there'd be any value in just a question on stuff.
Okay, so Messi for teams, your 3 best books, where you can buy them, and random GCSEs.
So, thank you very much. In terms of what everyone should read, everyone should buy the hardback of Messi.
You've got to start with the team.
Which makes I'm randomising the order, right. Kamal. Come on. Have you learned nothing? Have you learned nothing? So, yes, you should all buy the hardback of Messi for Christmas. I'm happy to sign copies. Something else that people might enjoy that is new and you might not have heard of is a BBC World Service radio series and podcast that I'm doing called The 50 Inventions That Shaped the Modern Economy. And unlike Messi, it's completely free, so you can just subscribe to the podcast and enjoy. So that 2's enough, I think. 2's enough, but thank you for the opportunity to sell. In terms of education, I think my sense is that a lot of people in education, particularly a lot of teachers, are frustrated that the system is over-organized. And we see that it's over-structured. There's a lot of testing. And when you start testing, you need standardized questions and you need a syllabus, and because otherwise it doesn't work. And yet we kind of know that this doesn't necessarily help prepare our students for the wider world. And there's this tension between trying to test people and evaluate them, and we evaluate the schools and the teachers and the education system and the students all using the same system, which makes no sense. And we'd benefit from more randomness, but I don't know how easy it is to get in there. We can all do that a little bit, whether we're teachers, whether we're parents, whatever we are. Just observe an informal game of football versus a formal game of football. You think a formal game of football, that's more structured, you're going to learn more about football. You've got a referee, you've got the pitch, you've got the tactics, and yeah, you'll learn more about football, but you won't learn more about life. Because in an informal game of street football, you've got kids of all ages having to get along with each other. They come, they go, they all have to be happy, because the grown-ups won't force them to keep playing till the 90 minutes are up. So you've got to keep everyone happy, you've got to keep everybody in roughly equal size, they have to referee themselves, they have to learn all kinds of skills. They may not be great footballers, but they'll be better human beings as a result. So sometimes letting go of the structure can really help. Teamwork, there is a chapter in the book about teams and about different team structures and what they do, and including the structures of teams that made the greatest computer games in history, which is that Wonderful work done by some mathematically minded sociologists. What I would say about sports teams, yes, they are often very, very tidy and very highly controlling. And I talk about a wonderful British rowing 8 that is the absolute opposite of messy and were incredibly successful. But I don't think that that is, contrary to what many motivational speakers will tell you, I don't think that's necessarily a good preparation for life. When we think about Dave Brailsford, you mentioned Dave Brailsford at Team Sky and British Cycling. They're going for this incremental improvements. They go for these marginal gains. It's very powerful. I often talk about it. I often advocate it. But we have to understand the nature of the system they're operating in. There was a wonderful Scottish cyclist a few years ago called Graham Obery. He would build his bikes out of tumble dryers and washing machines with all kinds of weird and wonderful cycling positions. And he kept winning competitions and breaking records. And World Cycling Federation kept coming along and saying, no, you can't do that. So outlaw his bike. So build a new bike. And he'd win something and say, no, you can't do that. And he'd build and yet another bike. And they'd say, you can't do that. So Graham Obery was exploring in a highly innovative way all the different ways you could do cycling. And he kept being shut down. So that's why the marginal improvements approach works so incredibly well, because fundamentally it's a very tidy, constrained situation. There are many tidy, constrained situations in the world, and a tidy, constrained approach can be very powerful. I like spreadsheets. I like a clean kitchen surface. I'm a big fan of the shipping container. Structure can work. Tidiness can work. But sometimes it's a little bit too tempting. Sometimes we need to let go. We need to adopt that jazzier, more improvised spirit, because in a lot of the problems that are most important to us, that involve most innovation, that involve most human contact, that make us most human, mess is fundamental. And it may make us anxious. I know it's made Kamal extremely anxious, but we nevertheless need to embrace it.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Intelligence Squared for bringing together such a great evening, for you being a fabulous audience. That 90 minutes has whizzed by, but most of all to Tim Harford, who will be signing books outside. Thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.